Nathan Carter rolled his wheelchair up the newly installed ramp leading to his front door, taking a deep breath as he glanced around his new neighborhood. Maple Ridge, at first glance, was the epitome of suburban perfection. Neatly trimmed lawns, pastel-colored houses, and friendly smiles from neighbors walking their dogs. It was supposed to be a fresh start, a peaceful escape from the chaos of the city. But as Nathan was about to learn, appearances could be deceiving. Nathan had been a high school teacher for over 2 decades, a man of quiet dignity and resilience. His accident 3 years ago had changed his life forever, leaving him in a wheelchair. But it had not broken his spirit. Moving to Maple Ridge was meant to be a turning point, a place where he could regain a sense of independence, where he wouldn't be defined by his disability. But from the very first day, something felt off. As he settled in, Nathan noticed curious glances from certain neighbors. Some were genuinely friendly, offering warm welcomes and small talk about the community. Others, however, weren't as inviting. He caught whispers behind his back, stolen glances of disapproval. At first, he brushed it off. After all, being the newcomer in a tight-knit suburban neighborhood always came with a bit of scrutiny. But then he met Margaret Holloway. Nathan had heard about Margaret before he even spoke to her. The self-proclaimed Queen of Maple Ridge, she had been the head of the Homeowners Association, HOA, for over 15 years. A woman in her 60s with iron-grey hair and an unnervingly sharp gaze, Margaret ruled the neighborhood with an unspoken authority. The HOA was her personal kingdom, and every home, every yard, every mailbox had to fit her vision of perfection. Anything out of place, and she would swoop in like a vulture. The first time she laid eyes on Nathan's wheelchair ramp, her expression tightened. Her eyes narrowed with cold calculation, as if she had already labeled him as a problem. It wasn't the wheelchair that bothered her. It was what it represented: change, disruption, a crack in the flawless image she had spent years curating. Nathan didn't have to wait long for her first strike. The next morning, as he was enjoying his coffee on the porch, a sharp knock echoed from his front door. He opened it to find a crisp white envelope sitting on his welcome mat. A letter from the HOA. Dear Mr. Carter, as per the Homeowners Association's guidelines, all exterior modifications to homes in Maple Ridge must be pre-approved by the board. Your recent installation of a wheelchair ramp does not comply with community aesthetic standards. We kindly request that you remove it immediately to avoid further action. Nathan felt his jaw tighten. He had researched the HOA guidelines before installing the ramp. There was no rule prohibiting it, and even if there were, federal law protected his right to accessibility. This wasn't about regulations. This was personal. As Nathan crumpled the letter in his hand, he felt a storm brewing. He had faced challenges before, but this was different. He was being targeted, and something told him Margaret wasn't going to stop at a single letter. She was testing him, and if there was one thing Nathan Carter didn't do, it was back down from a fight. Margaret's power play. The war begins. Nathan sat in his living room, gripping the HOA complaint letter in his hand. His instincts told him this was only the beginning. Margaret Holloway wasn't just a woman who enforced rules. She was a predator, and Nathan had just stepped into her territory. The next few days confirmed his suspicions. The harassment started subtly. At first, he received emails from the HOA citing vague complaints. His lawn was slightly overgrown, his mailbox was the wrong shade of black, his trash cans were visible from the street. It was all nonsense, technicalities that no one else seemed to be punished for. But it was clear, Margaret was tightening the noose. Nathan tried to push it aside, but then the rumors started. One evening, as he rolled his wheelchair down the sidewalk, he overheard 2 women whispering on their porches. I heard he didn't even get proper approval for that ramp. Some people just move in and think they can change everything. Nathan exhaled sharply. Margaret was spreading her poison, turning the neighborhood against him. He wasn't just a newcomer anymore, he was an outsider, an intruder. And then things escalated. One night, Nathan woke to a loud bang. His heart pounded as he wheeled himself to the window. His ramp was gone. Or more specifically, it had been vandalized. The wood was splintered, a section had been ripped out, making it unsafe for him to use. His fingers clenched around the windowsill. This wasn't just petty complaints anymore, this was sabotage. Nathan installed security cameras the very next day. If someone wanted to come onto his property and mess with his home, they'd have to do it on record. But Margaret was clever. She wouldn't get her hands dirty herself. Instead, she sent her allies in the HOA to keep up the pressure. 2 days later, another letter arrived. This one wasn't just a complaint. It was a fine. You have been found in violation of Maple Ridge's community aesthetic guidelines. If your ramp is not removed within 10 days, you will be fined $200 per day until it is taken down. Nathan let out a bitter chuckle. They destroyed his ramp, and now they were fining him for it. It was textbook intimidation, a power play designed to exhaust him into giving up. But Nathan Carter wasn't built like that. Instead of backing down, he decided to fight fire with fire. He started knocking on doors, talking to neighbors, asking questions. At first, people were hesitant. Margaret had ruled over this place for too long, and fear kept them quiet. But slowly cracks began to show. She fined us for painting our house the wrong shade of blue. I had to replant my entire front garden because she said my flowers weren't uniform enough. She told my wife she approved our mailbox, but we had to donate to the HOA fundraiser first. Nathan's mind clicked. This wasn't just about him. Margaret had bullied this entire community for years. That night, as he reviewed the HOA documents he had requested, something caught his eye. A name. A company. A connection that shouldn't exist. Nathan felt his pulse quicken. Margaret wasn't just an HOA tyrant. She was profiting off of all of this. The hidden truth. Nathan uncovers Margaret's dark secret. Nathan's hands tightened around the HOA documents, his eyes scanning the financial records, property transactions, and internal memos. What he saw sent a chill down his spine. Margaret wasn't just a control freak, she was running a scam. Buried in the files were records of suspicious real estate deals, all tied back to a shell company called Holloway Property Solutions. The same last name. Her name. Nathan dug deeper, cross-referencing addresses with former homeowners. It all made sense now. Margaret had been using the HOA to push people out, forcing them to sell their homes under pressure. Then, through her shell company, she'd buy the properties at below-market prices, flip them, and make a fortune. She'd been doing this for years, quietly, efficiently, and without opposition. Nathan felt his pulse quicken. He finally had something real. He wasted no time. Over the next few days, he reached out to former residents who had mysteriously moved away. Some refused to talk, still afraid of Margaret's reach. But others, they were ready to speak. She made our lives hell with constant fines until we gave up and sold. I lost everything because of that woman. She told us it was either sell or be sued by the HOA. We didn't have a choice. Nathan recorded every conversation, collected emails, and even managed to get a whistleblower from within the HOA board, a man named Roger Whitman. Listen, I never agreed with what she did, but Margaret, she's ruthless. She kept everything quiet. Anyone who questioned her, they got shut down. Roger provided HOA emails and board meeting notes, proving that Margaret had intentionally manipulated regulations, selectively enforced fines, and blackmailed homeowners into selling. This was bigger than Nathan had thought. But just as he was finalizing his evidence, Margaret struck back. That night, Nathan was woken by the sound of shattering glass. His heart pounded as he turned on his security cameras, watching the live feed. A dark figure stood outside his house, smashing his windows with a baseball bat. Then, in a bold move, they spray-painted a message on his garage door. "Get out!" Nathan clenched his fists. She was desperate now. By morning, neighbors gathered around, murmuring among themselves. Some looked uncomfortable, others looked guilty. Margaret had kept them in line with fear for years. But this was too far. Nathan didn't hesitate. He took all the evidence he had gathered, documents, recordings, and witness statements, and sent it directly to the local news, the city's housing authority, and a well-known investigative journalist. Margaret didn't realize it yet, but her empire was crumbling. At the next HOA meeting, Nathan was going to expose everything. And this time, there would be no escape for Margaret Holloway. The night of the HOA meeting arrived, and Nathan rolled into the Maple Ridge Community Center with a quiet determination. The room was packed. Neighbors filled the chairs, some standing along the walls, murmuring in hushed voices. Word had spread. The vandalism on Nathan's house, the escalating conflict, and now whispers of something much bigger. People wanted answers, and Nathan was ready to give them. At the front of the room, Margaret Holloway sat confidently, her usual smug smile in place. She adjusted her HOA badge, acting as if she was still in control. She had no idea what was coming. The meeting started as usual, boring procedural nonsense, rules, regulations, small community complaints. Nathan waited, biding his time. Then, when the floor opened for comments, he wheeled himself forward. "I have something to say." Nathan's voice was calm but carried a weight that silenced the murmurs. "Something that concerns everyone in this room." Margaret's smile froze. She leaned forward slightly, watching him carefully. For the first time, she looked uneasy. "For the past few weeks, I've been the target of fines, harassment, and outright vandalism. And at first, I thought it was just about my wheelchair ramp. But I was wrong. This isn't just about me. It's about every single person in this neighborhood." People shifted in their seats, glancing at one another. Nathan pulled out a stack of documents. "I did some digging. And what I found? It's corruption. Plain and simple." He held up the first piece of evidence, a record of real estate transactions linked to Holloway Property Solutions. Margaret Holloway has been using this HOA not to preserve the neighborhood, but to manipulate and push homeowners out. She fines people into exhaustion, pressures them into selling, and then, through her shell company, buys their homes dirt cheap and flips them for profit. A ripple of shock ran through the room. Margaret went pale. "That's absurd," she snapped, but her voice wavered. "You have no proof." Nathan's lips curled into a knowing smile. "Oh, but I do." He pulled out emails from former residents, records of forced sales, testimonies from neighbors who had been bullied into moving. He even had a whistleblower, Roger Whitman, a former HOA board member, ready to speak. "You called the shots, Margaret," Nathan continued. "You abused your position, rigged the system, and stole homes from the very people you claimed to protect." Margaret shot up from her seat. "This is a lie, a smear campaign." But the evidence was overwhelming. Neighbors were whispering, some nodding, others looking downright furious. The fear she had instilled in them for years was breaking. Then, the final blow. Nathan held up a flash drive. "This contains HOA meeting recordings where Margaret explicitly discusses weeding out undesirable homeowners. I sent copies to local news stations. The city's housing authority is already investigating." A wave of gasps filled the room. Margaret's face drained of color. "You can't—" But it was too late. One by one, neighbors stood up. "She fined me for parking in my own driveway. She forced my cousin to repaint her house 3 times. She made us feel like prisoners in our own homes." The board members turned on her. The same people who once backed her were now demanding her resignation. Margaret stumbled back, her reign crumbling in real time. She had ruled this neighborhood with an iron fist for years. But now? She was finished. Margaret's downfall and Nathan's victory. Margaret Holloway stood frozen at the front of the room, her face pale, her hands trembling as she clutched the edges of the podium. The Queen of Maple Ridge had just lost her throne. The room buzzed with angry murmurs. Neighbors who had once tiptoed around her were now turning against her, their voices growing louder with every passing second. "You manipulated us," someone shouted. "You stole our homes." Another neighbor added, his face red with fury. Margaret's lips parted, but no words came out. For the first time in her life, she was speechless. She had controlled this neighborhood for years, crushed anyone who opposed her, but now she was standing alone. Nathan watched from his seat, his hands gripping the wheels of his chair. He could feel the weight of the moment, the collective power of a community finally breaking free from the grip of a tyrant. But he wasn't finished yet. "The evidence has already been sent to the authorities," Nathan said, his voice calm but firm. "And I have a feeling they'll be paying you a visit very soon." Margaret spun to face him, her eyes burning with desperation. "You think you've won?" she hissed. "You think you can come into my neighborhood and destroy everything I built?" Nathan let out a slow, measured breath. You destroyed yourself, Margaret. You thought you could abuse your power forever, but people are smarter than you think. They don't forget. And now, you're the one being forced out. The crowd erupted. Some clapped, others cheered, a few simply shook their heads in disbelief. Margaret had ruled over them for years, but now her reign was over. And then the final blow came. The doors to the community centre swung open, and two city officials stepped inside, their expressions grim. They walked straight toward Margaret, pulling out a folder filled with documents. Mrs. Holloway, the city's housing authority, has officially opened an investigation into your real estate dealings, one of them announced. We need you to come with us for questioning. A collective gasp filled the room. Margaret staggered back, her eyes darting around, looking for a way out. But there was none. The same people she had controlled, manipulated, and threatened were now watching her fall. This is a mistake, she cried, but no one believed her anymore. As she was led out of the building, her former allies refused to meet her gaze. The people who had once feared her now saw her for what she truly was. A fraud, a thief, a coward. Nathan exhaled slowly, a wave of relief washing over him. It was finally over. With Margaret gone, Maple Ridge began to heal. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, and for the first time in years, people felt free. Nathan, once treated as an outsider, now became a respected figure in the community. His wheelchair ramp, which had once been a target of controversy, was now a symbol of resistance and justice. Neighbors started talking to each other again. Friendships rekindled, trust was rebuilt, and the HOA, now free from corruption, began focusing on actually helping the residents. One evening, Nathan sat on his porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. A small knock on his fence made him turn. It was Roger Whitman, the former HOA member who had helped expose Margaret. You did something amazing, Nathan, Roger said. You didn't just stand up for yourself, you saved this entire neighborhood. Nathan chuckled softly. I didn't do it alone. People just needed to remember that they had a voice. As Roger nodded and walked away, Nathan took a deep breath, feeling something he hadn't in a long time. Peace. The fight had been long, brutal, and at times exhausting, but in the end, justice had won.